This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right, well, it's great to be here. It's great to be in the great state of Georgia. It's wonderful to be on this beautiful campus. And I'd like to thank Professor Bauerlein for inviting me down to talk to you all about the King James Bible. What I want to do today is I want to talk about three things with respect to the King James Bible. The first is I want to talk about something about its genesis and the principles that went into the translation and production of the King James Bible. Then I want to talk a little bit about its influence on the English language, and which is much discussed. And then in the third part, perhaps going to be the longer part, I want to talk about the influence of the Bible more broadly on Western culture. So you'll get some specifics about the King James Bible, but also I'm going to give you some of my thoughts about how the Bible has shaped humanism in the West. So the Bible, its genesis, it's not the first translation of the Bible into the English language. In fact, William Tyndale, one of the English reformers, translated the Bible in about 75 years before the King James Version was produced. There was another Bible called the Bishop's Bible. Of course, Martin Luther famously translated the Bible into German, and it became the most influential biblical translation in German. There were French translations and so forth. The impetus for these Bible translations was the Reformation. So one of the principles of the Reformation, and Martin Luther, when he nailed the 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, one of the principles of the Reformation was the imperative, the urgency that the scriptures be brought to all Christians in a language that they can understand. And so the Latin of the Vulgate, the Latin translation that the church used and the Catholic Church used officially up until the Second Vatican Council 50 years ago, the Vulgate and Latin was a language only known by the educated elite. And so one of the goals of Luther was to get the Bible to the sort of ordinary person in the pew. And William Tyndale was the English reformer who pushed that forward. And he didn't actually complete an entire translation of the Bible. He died before it was completed, but he largely is responsible for the translation that was used in the 75 or so years before the production of the King James Bible. Now, why King James? Well, it's called the King James Bible because James I, King of England, was facing theological, religious problems. So English religious history is very contested, as English Protestantism was, unlike Calvinism and Lutheranism, English Protestantism was kind of a mixed bag. And you had what you would call maybe sort of the left-wing reformers, who we know of as the Puritans. And then you had what I would call the right-wing conformers, who wanted to change as little as possible in the worship and theology of the medieval church. So you would have what maybe you would call, say Puritan iconoclasts, or you had kind of what high church Anglo-Catholic folks who wanted a more ritual and so forth. And so when James I assumed power, Queen Elizabeth kind of juggled these two factions, but there was a constant source of tension in English culture. So much tension that ultimately exploded into a civil war in the middle of the 17th century, 20 or 30 years after the publication of the King James Bible. So this was the culture war of England for about 150 years. This contest between what I would call the right-wing reformers and the left-wing reformers. Catholicism, that was out of the picture, but it was this sort of right and left-wing reformers. And so part of the purpose that what King James wanted to do is he wanted to produce a unifying biblical translation. And it's a work of, as Professor Bauerlein said, it was a work of committees. He authorized the establishment of a commission to translate the Bible. And that's a big project. The Bible's a big book. There's a lot of words in the Bible. And so what they did is he established 6 groups that were staffed each by 19 scholars, an odd number so that they could vote on controversial translations. And now these scholars were, these translators were the great linguists of their day. It really is the Reformation 100 years earlier that really launched a kind of revolution in European literary, historical, and linguistic study. Because part of the Reformation is, the whole idea of the Reformation is that the Catholic Church had betrayed the true teachings of Christianity. Well, how do we know what the true teachings of Christianity are? We consult the original document of Christianity, the Bible. But wait a minute, the Bible is not written in any language that anybody in Europe in the 15th and 16th and 17th century could read. Ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek. And so, obviously, if we're going to have a debate about what a passage in the Bible really means, then we have to have scholars who have the credentials and the linguistic skills to give us an accurate answer. So it's like expert witnesses in a trial. And so starting with the Reformation for about 75 years before, so I think James sets up this commission in 1607. So for about 75 years, it's been this intensive, it was to the university culture of the 16th century what the medical complex at Emory is to 21st century academic culture. Big science. It was the big science. It was the growth industry of academic culture. And so people trained themselves up in ancient Hebrew. They also discovered that there are different manuscripts of the Bible that weren't exactly the same. And so there was a scholarly debate about that and what the words actually mean. Hebrew is ancient Hebrew, typically when you want to know what words mean, you compare them with their uses elsewhere, right? But it turns out there is only one text written in ancient Hebrew, and it is the Old Testament. And so how do you know what the words in the Old Testament mean? You can compare them to other words and other uses in the Old Testament. So it turns out to be it's a profound scholarly puzzle. And so these folks on these committees were the kind of university professors. They were part of this maturing scholarly discipline that eventually evolved into modern biblical study. And I would submit it's the foundation of modern humanistic social scientific study, not natural sciences, but everything at Emory that runs from psychology to classics, basically as a modern form of academic inquiry, has its roots in this struggle to get the accurate interpretation of the Bible, the accurate meaning of the Bible. Like I say, it was a matter of existential urgency to people. They wanted to make sure that their faith was the true faith. It was a matter of political urgency. Which side should triumph in these intense political struggles for control of the church and, through the church, control of society itself. So James wanted to have it be a scholarly project. And he laid down essentially 2 rules. He had a number of principles, but the 2 most important were conservatism of language and no theology. So all the other translations in the past had theological notes that would tell you what obscure passages really meant in terms of whether you're a Calvinist, there were little glosses. And so the King James Bible is the first, I would call, academic translation, the first translation made by groups of scholars. It's the first translation that did not provide theological notes to tell you, that this is obviously where Lutheranism is true, or Calvinism is true, or Catholicism is true. And then the conservatism had to do with the fact that James recognized that continuity of language is a very unifying approach to corporate life, broadly speaking. And so the Tyndale version of the Bible, produced in the 1530s, which was the basis of this Bishop's Bible, which was produced in the 1550s, the idea was that the King James Version was to use the same translations as these earlier Bibles whenever possible, whenever accuracy permitted it. So those two principles give us were the most important ones in shaping the Bible, the translation. And so if we think about that, the conservatism, this continuity with the Bishop's Bible, it's the predecessor translations of the Bible. This means that the King James Version of the Bible had archaic language in it from the get-go. So when somebody got it hot off the printer's press in 1611 or 1613 and read it, that person in London reading the King James Version of the Bible would have felt it to be old-fashioned English, not contemporary English, because of this principle of preserving these older formulations. And that's an important reason why it has a kind of resonance to it. Let me give you kind of an example of this kind of archaic language. So this is from the book of Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" I don't think people were saying darkeneth in 1611. They were saying darkeneth in 1535, but not in 1611. "Gird up thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding." I mean, this is a kind of archaic language. We certainly feel it to be archaic, but I think an important point is that this principle of conservatism, conservation of the earlier translations, meant that it was old-fashioned from the get-go. It was ye olde English from the get-go. And then the idea that there's no theology. The earlier translations, as I said, had these theological notes, and they also tended to tilt the translation in one way or another according to what made it came out right in terms of theology. And so these scholarly committees effected a translation that put an emphasis on the scholarly discipline of philology, that is to say, expert knowledge in different uses of Hebrew, especially Hebrew. That's the most problematic one. Ancient Greek, we have a huge body of literature, and so the word meanings aren't always so obscure. But so what the committee did, not only did they preserve the archaic language of 2-3 generations earlier, but in their translations, they consistently, and Tyndale had done the same thing, but they accentuated it, they consistently preserved the Hebrew idioms and the Hebrew patterns of speech. They gave a literal translation of the Bible. And this is perhaps the most significant literary quality of the King James Version. That when you read the King James Version, you are experiencing the cadences of ancient Hebrew. Let me give you an example of this. So this is from the fall, Genesis 3. He said unto the woman, "Yea, hath God said, ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" Or he goes on to say, and then God later asks, "Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee thou shouldst not eat?" These are hard sentences to speak in the English language. Hast thou eaten the tree whereof I have commanded? But the Hebrew itself has a word order that the translators preserved. So they translate the word order of the Hebrew. And later on, Adam says to God, when God is saying to him, "Hey, have you eaten of that tree?" Adam responds, "She gave me of the tree, and I did eat." So again, these are formulations that are alien to the English language, but they're Hebraisms. I mean, one of the other ones that is very very relentless in the Old Testament, and we get it again in the New Testament. It's important to realize that the New Testament writers were native Aramaic speakers, which is a descendant language from Hebrew. And so they themselves had sentence structures that were Hebraic in character rather than English, the way that we do it in the English language. So even the New Testament itself has this. One example of this And you find this in the Bible, and next time you look at your Bible, King James Version, look at this. The relentless use of the word and. So the flood narrative. And they went unto Noah into the ark, 2 by 2, of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. And they went in male and female, as God commanded. And the Lord shut them in. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth. And the waters increased, and bare up the ark. And it was lifted up above the earth. And the waters prevailed, and were greatly increased upon the earth. And the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole earth were covered, and so on, and so on, and so on. So let's look at that. Let's look at one, I think, that is a kind of useful one to get this Hebrew element. And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. Now compare this with some modern translations. I did a little research on modern translations. So the King James Version, and the waters prevailed, and were greatly increased, and the ark went upon the face of the others. The New Jerusalem Bible, this is a Catholic translation from the 1960s. The waters rose and swelled greatly upon the earth, and the ark sailed on the waters. The Revised English Bible, which is in English for England, for the Church of England, again, 20th century. The ark floated on the surfaces they got rid of all the ands altogether. The ark floated, so the New Jerusalem Bible gets rid of the metaphor. Went upon the face of the waters, and gives you sailed, literal. Although it's not literal in the sense, the Hebrew actually has the image, sailed upon the face of the waters, whatever that means. The surface, I guess. Revised English Bible, the ark floated on the surface of the swollen waters as they increased over the earth. Or the New Living Translation, as the waters rose higher and higher above the ground, the ark floated safely on the surface. So, you know, a lot of people talk about the linguistic power of the King James Version. And I think this comparison strikes me as a good example of this. It's not the hath, the he hath done that. It's not the these and the thous ultimately that give it its power. There are no these and thous in and the water prevailed, and the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly on the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. There's something other. We're reading another language. It feels otherworldly to us because that's not the way we normally talk. And I think that's part of the power of the Old Testament. I mean, of the King James Version as a translation. Now, some people complain. Let's go to reception and its influence. Some people complained about the literalness of the King James Version. There's a kind of famous literary figure of the time who said that if I translate a French book into English, I turn it into English phrase and not into French English. Il fait froid, French, right? It's cold. I say, 'tis cold, not it makes cold, which is a literal translation of il fait froid. But so, in other words, what he says that there's a bad translation because it Hebraicizes the English rather than Englishizes the Hebrew. But the truth is that that's part of the genius of the King James Bible as a literary artifact. Is it gives us new cadences. It adds new cadences to the English language. And so it also gives turns of phrase that are unique to Hebrew and so on. So obviously the cadences are, the Lord's Prayer is, a Hebrew prayer that Jesus teaches. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. These are the kinds of cadences of the language which are so powerful in our own language. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. So these kinds of language, I want to give you an example from the 19th century. So, okay, think about it. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, and so forth. fourscore and 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's a biblical cadence to the Gettysburg Address, which I would submit as kind of a political psalm in our political culture. And so the enrichment of the English language was largely through the importation of the cadences and repetitions of Hebrew that are often actually effaced or disguised by contemporary translations that Englishize the Hebrew rather than Hebraicizing the English. It also gives us certain turns of phrase: sour grapes, fly in the ointment, root of the matter, eat, drink, and be merry. Those are all Old Testament images. That it also kept, because of the principle of conservation, it kept certain old English words alive. There was a big move or trend in the English language during Shakespeare's era to move away from kind of Anglo-Saxonisms and towards more Latinate word usage. So words like unwittingly, warfare, ponder, avenge, these were words that were falling out of the English language but were restored to them because of the fact that the King James Version preserved the old language of 3 generations earlier. So overall, in terms of influence, the King James Bible became the Hebrew idioms, the old-fashioned words, the these and the thous. In fact, I went to a small college outside of Philadelphia that had a Quaker heritage, and I went to dinner with one of the old professors who was what's known as a birthright Quaker. And the birthright Quaker means somebody who was born a Quaker. And he used the thee and the thou. He and his wife used thee and thou with each other. It's like, whoa, what's going on there? And that was clearly a function both of the conservatism. There's a kind of Mennonite quality to that, to preserve the old ways, but also the King James Bible keeps the thee and the thou as a living way of address, living familiar mode of address. I don't know if people realize that thee and thou, we think it's formal because it's from the Bible, but it's actually the informal mode of address. So when Western culture, when English culture became egalitarian, instead of moving everybody down to the familiar, like in German you have Sie is a formal mode of address, whereas Du is the informal mode of address. And so instead of moving the language down, they moved it up. So everybody became a nobleman. We address everybody in the formal you instead of thou. But the Bible uses thee and thou. It's very important because God addresses us in familiar, and we address God in the familiar. It's our high language. It's the language of solemn diction, and obviously the Gettysburg Address is a good example of that. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches they quote obviously from the King James Bible, but his cadences also come from the King James Bible. Now, this comes about for probably 2 reasons. Why is the King James Bible the language we use when we want to be solemn? And there are a couple reasons for that, 3 reasons for that. First, use gives language meaning. Use gives language meaning. If you recited the same shopping list at crucial moments in your life, that shopping list would take on a kind of quasi-sacred meaning. And there's something about use of language that makes it sacred. So one of the liturgical scholars, they always want to change the way that we pray, to make it more dynamic or to make it more contemporary or to make it more accurate to the way that people worshipped in what they imagined to be Christian worship in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. But one thing they cannot dislodge from the prayer of 21st century English-speaking people is the Lord's Prayer, which I recited. Hallowed be thy name. So I go to these sort of contemporary services. Everything is all very contemporary, hip music, et cetera, et cetera. But you get to the Lord's Prayer, and why is that the case? It's because people have internalized and they fused their own spiritual experiences with those archaic phrases. And so they hold on to them because they're weighted with a lifetime of prayer and spiritual experience. So as I said, a shopping list could become quasi-sacred for us if at the birth of our children or at the death of our parents, we recited that shopping list. And so just use in the context of worship makes it sacred. And then the archaic language that is preserved is language outside of the mundane flow of life. And so if you want to speak about something that's not mundane, not everyday, and you use the high language of the King James Version, you are signaling to people this is not an ordinary event. This is not an ordinary issue. This is not an ordinary problem. This is fundamental, or it's transcendent. And so archaic is outside of the mundane flow of life. And then the literalness of the King James Version, especially in the Hebrew, preserves the prayer-like language of ancient Hebrew. Most of the Old Testament was written to be used liturgically, to be read in the context of worship, and to be recited and memorized and used in prayer. And so it's phrased for recitation. So its cadences lend themselves to public oration, where you speak in a way that has a kind of repetitive power or an ability to receive in a powerful way. So it's influence, I think, in the language from these different functions, especially this introducing into the English language. I want to emphasize here, before I move to a more substantive question about its influence on our worldview, that I want to emphasize again that the language is renewed or deepened, the English language, by the Hebrew. And through the New Testament, Hebraicized Greek. That has the New Testament also quotes the Old Testament quite a bit. So that's a kind of interesting thought, how language, and English language is uniquely, really among world languages, it's one of the most absorptive and plastic. And it also changes very rapidly. And partly because the English language, for whatever reason, it seems to be able to renew itself with new forms of expression, new vocabulary. And I think the King James Bible represented a very important milestone in that transformation of the English language. All right, so, okay, I mean, I'm not a linguist. I'm not a scholar of the English language, a philologist, whatever that would be. Is that somebody who takes blood, a philologist? No, that's a phlebotomist. But I am a theology professor. And I think that the King James Bible, not because it's the King James Bible, but instead because it's the Bible and because it's written in English and because it became the widely accessible form of the Bible in the English-speaking West, that its influence is primarily through the worldview that it presents. Now here I don't mean its theological tenets. They are very influential too, of course, hugely influential. But I really mean it's the biblical voice that is influential. The biblical, and here's what I mean, or the biblical idiom, or the biblical literary vision. Archaic to say that. I mean, it's anachronistic to say that, but I will anyway. And that's that the Bible mixes the high with the low. It mixes the transcendent with the mundane. And that this has a huge influence, I think. It's the root of Western humanism. So I'm going to give you my argument to that effect. I brought with me, I was kind of thinking, I was in Professor Bauerlein's office and I got a copy of the Iliad and I was thinking about different sections of the Bible. I mean, this is an epic, yes? Right? You guys also read tragedies? Did you guys read a tragedy in this class? Which one did you read? No? Nobody read one? Yeah? Antigone, okay. So you read a tragedy. And then what about comedies? Do you guys do comedy?
The Odyssey.
Oh, I think the Odyssey is also an epic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Reading Dante in a few weeks.
I don't think I think the Divine Comedy is actually what the Bible is. I mean, comedy is, so tragedy is about what is high, the gods and the fundamental realities of human life. And so Antigone, who are the characters in Antigone? You got Antigone and her brother, right, who dies. And then she goes out, and then the king, who doesn't want her to be out there because it's what's his name again? Creon. And anybody else? Doesn't she have a maid? Does she have a maid? Oh, she has sisters. Does she have a maid, Antigone? She has an old nurse. What's her name? Does she have a name? I can't remember. I think so too. Okay? So there are no little people in tragedy. There are no little people in epic. These are all big people, representative people. These are royalty or great warriors in epic and in the tragic, because they're dealing with high things. They're dealing with transcendent things. And little people are not part of transcendent things. And so the ancient literature does have stories of little people. And those are comedies about everyday life. And one of the ones I used to assign is Petronius' Satyricon. Has anybody ever read Petronius' Satyricon? I like to assign it because it's just full of raunchy sex. And I want my students to recognize that there's nothing new under the sun. And that it's not like our culture has discovered sexual license or sexual adventure or anything like that. Believe me, the Satyricon has got plenty of sexual adventure, sexual self-expression. It's got plenty of identity issues in it, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's helpful for us to realize that there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to something so fundamental as human sexuality. But also it's like to assign it because it's a comedy. It's about obscure people who blunder their way through life and the foibles and problems that they face. The Bible is unique in ancient literature because it combines insignificant people with significant people. Or better yet, it combines the most significant character, God of course, with insignificant characters. So you think about it, the book of Genesis starts, chapter 1. What's the perspective of chapter 1? It's written from what point of view? It's a third person, but where's that third person sitting? Watching what? Everything. So it's a kind of cosmic point of view. I mean, you couldn't think of something bigger than that. I mean, look, in Greek, the Greek historical imagination, the battle for Troy was a big thing. I mean, that was when giants walked the earth, and that's that great scene in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes back, and the suitors, they're just such small people. They just, this bow, I can't pull it back, and he gets up and pulls his bow back. And there was a time when real men walked the earth. And those are the men who fought on the plains of Troy. They were larger than life. They are larger than life. But how much larger is the scene in Genesis 1? And then 12 chapters later, it collapses down onto some obscure nomad wandering around in the ancient Middle East, lying to Pharaoh, involved in this, all this frustration with his infertile wife, having this kind of comic interaction with Hagar, the mistress, who Sarah convinces Abraham to sleep with to have a son, and this is not a good plan. It leads to bitterness and conflict. And what in the world could this possibly have to do with the fate of the universe? You could think about it, right? You read about Achilles, and you could think to yourself, there's a kind of deep truth about the human condition at work. in the character of Achilles, at least something, or Odysseus. At least there's something grand. There's a grandeur about those characters. There's no grandeur about Abraham. There's no grandeur about Abraham. And this combination of the two, it strikes me as a very powerful, powerful thing. Because what it does is it means that our little lives are potentially fraught with transcendent significance. And so little people have interior lives. We have interior lives. We have a drama that we're participating in, even here, even now, even though we can't pull back the bow, even though we're not able to see things from the great cosmological perspective. So that's one sense in which the biblical story is so influential in the development and so different from classical antiquity. You're just hard pressed to find. I mean, you've got who are the two women that Agamemnon and Achilles fight over? Briseis and Chryseis. Okay, so they have names, but they have no feelings. I don't think, do they? Right. I mean, Achilles and Agamemnon also fight over, the other booty of war, inanimate booty, and these two women are just part of the booty of war that the two big men are fighting over. But I want to kind of I don't want to go on too long on this, but there's also a difference in the way in which Homer. I mean, this difference makes a difference. And one example I want to think about this is I was thinking of the passage that I was kind of fixing on. I was trying to figure out a way I could kind of connect this up in a more literary way. And I thought, tears, right? So we get a wonderful scene of where Priam comes to Achilles. This is what, book 24. And it's a great scene. I remember reading this as an undergraduate, just kind of being blown away. So Achilles says, like the gods, remember your father, this is Priam, who was of years like mine and on the doorsill of sorrowful old age. Think about him. 50 were my sons, 19 were born to the womb of a single mother. They're all gone. Hector, for whose sake I came now to the ships of the Achaeans to win him back from you. I bring you gifts beyond number. Honor then the gods, Achilles. Take pity on me, remembering your father. Yet I am still more pitiful. I've gone through what no other mortal on earth has gone through. I put my lips to the hands of the man who has killed my children. So he kisses his hands, begging him to give back the body of his son. So it's a moving scene, but boy, you sure get a lot of, Priam is there, he's giving you the speech, telling you what he's feeling, and then he spoke, stirred the passion of the other, grieving for his own father. Achilles is grieving for his own father, so we know why. He took the old man's hand and pushed him gently away, and the two remembered silently together as Priam sat huddled at the feet of Achilles and wept close for the manslaughtering Hector, and Achilles wept now for his own father, and now again for Patroclus. So it's a great scene. Two great warriors recognizing, I suppose, it's multi-layered, the cruel reality of death. They're kind of unified, even though they're arch enemies, are fighting these two sides, fighting each other. They're kind of unified in their common mortality. So a wonderful scene. But I think it's important to sort of see big speeches. You're told a lot about the why and the wherefore of that scene, which culminates. So in Achilles giving back the body of Hector to Priam. I think this scene is actually very important in the Iliad because the big problem in the Iliad is that Achilles winds up becoming inhuman. In other words, it's a kind of commentary on the dangerous nature of human greatness, that we all want to be great, but there's a kind of danger that will exceed the human frame, and then we'll become inhuman. And so this scene is important because he returns to the human frame of reference, Achilles, and he shares with Priam their common humanity. The dust we have come, the dust we shall return, I think is basically what is going on here. And I think that's kind of the great drama of the Iliad, is the unquenchable rage of Achilles, the supernatural divine rage of Achilles, and not the destructiveness. Of course, the great power that provides him, he allows him to triumph, but the destructiveness of human relationships that causes. But I don't want to do a commentary on, although I just did, didn't I, on the Iliad. Instead, it just made me, I thought about that, I thought, there's a great scene of tears in the New Testament. And of course, it's when Peter weeps for having denied Christ. And you compare book 24 of the Iliad, which is a very long, as you guys know from having read, did you guys read the whole thing? Yeah, you don't have to read much to know that it's long-winded. It tells you a lot. It tells you everything they had at the banquets. It tells you who all the different armies are. And the concision of the Bible is really quite striking in that regard. So Peter is beneath the palace. And this is where Jesus is being spit upon and so forth and tried in Pilate's palace. So Peter came beneath in the palace. There cometh out one of the maids of the high priest. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, "And thou wast with Jesus of Nazareth." But he denied, saying, "I was not. Neither understand I what thou sayest." And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And a maid saw him again, and began to say to him, to them that stood by, "This is one of them." And he denied it again. And a little after, they that stood by said again to Peter, "Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto." But he began to curse and to swear, saying, "I know not this man of whom ye speak." And the second time the cock crew, and Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said unto him, "Before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice." And when he thought thereon, he wept. So two weeping scenes of these two scenes. One is, boy, talk about a nobody. Peter is a nobody. He's from some province. He's from like Nebraska, where I lived for 20 years. He's from Nebraska, and he's a fisherman, and so on. And so, unlike Homer, he's one of those people that doesn't have a name in a tragedy, or doesn't have a name in the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so that's interesting itself. But also it's interesting how little the Bible tells us about what he's thinking. The Bible gives its characters space, if you will. It doesn't. It's a paradox, it seems to me, that maybe it's just my prejudice as a theologian, but it strikes me that the passage I just read from the Gospel of Mark gives more room for personality than does the book 24 of the Iliad. By saying less, there's more space in the interior life for interior life. So there's a kind of space there's a place for this fusion. Now, of course, this whole scene with him weeping is, for Christians, really at the apex of human history, right? This is where this is the axis on which the world's going to turn. So it's about an obscure nobody at the moment where the world is turning on its axis, and it's a kind of moment of interior emotion that's described in such spare ways that it's a kind of authorial. The author is not sort of filling in for you. There's kind of space for him there to be, in your own mind's eye, a person that you have to actually, maybe I hadn't thought about it. There's space for you to put yourself, it strikes me, in that passage. Whereas there's no place for you there's a place for you as a human being in book 24. We all face our mortality. We all share the reality of death. And so there's a place for all of us in book 24. But there's probably not a place for all of us. Well, maybe there is. We try as professors to make a place for everyone when Achilles slays Hector. And there is. I mean, there's this whole question about, you know, right? Doesn't he get the fateful moment comes when Achilles sees. He sees Hector and he sees his own armor. How's that work? But there's a kind of crucial moment. But anyway, it's a kind of deep insight into human psychology, just as Book 24 is a deep insight into human psychology. And we all participate in that. But we participate in it generically. You know, we participate in it in our common humanity. Whereas I think the Peter story, because it's so spare and there's so little of him, if you will, that there's a place for us as individuals and not just as generic human beings. I think that's an important part of the way the biblical world works. I think that's true for David when he weeps over the death of his son Absalom, very mysterious kind of passage. And it's true for Abraham when he ascends Mount Moriah in chapter 22 of the book of Genesis to sacrifice Isaac. So little is told about what is going on in the minds of those two people, Abraham and Isaac, that leaves kind of space. So I think this is the deepest influence of the Bible on Western culture. And it's an influence that is not theological, but is literary in the broadest sense. And bringing forward the English translation to make it accessible widely in Western culture, in English-speaking Western culture, was kind of ensured its penetration. So, and I would submit that Western humanism has a great deal, is in many ways indebted to this particular literary dimension of the Bible. Well, I've gone on too long. I want to give you guys time for any kind of questions, right? Professor Bauerlein said you're supposed to think of questions while I'm talking.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.